Today's speakers are Betosh Bahadur and Tatiana Wanderer. Dr. Tatiana Wanderer is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Alliances at Synchrogenics, a Certara company. Betosh Bahadur is the Senior Manager of Quality and Compliance for the nonprofit Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, CISCRIPT. Tatiana and Betosh, welcome to the presentation. I'll now turn it over to Betosh to begin the webinar.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Very briefly, we'd like to give background on our partnership and our organizations. CISCRIPT is an 11-year-old nonprofit organization that is independent. We are a trusted resource for patients and the public when it comes to information about clinical research participation. In our partnership to develop lay language summaries, CISCRIPT provides lay language writing expertise in the development of each and every lay summary. Through an editorial panel, we confirm lay language compliance and non-promotional nature of these documents, and we also produce graphic layouts that aid in understanding and comprehension for lay audiences, as well as facilitating translation and distribution of the materials. Our partners, Synchrogenics, are a 30-year-old global regulatory writing company, and they are the only artificial intelligence technology-using company in the industry. They provide the regulatory writing and scientific background expertise that is needed in the development of our lay summaries, and we're so happy today to say that we offer a stable, transparent, and reliable process that provides efficiencies for the partners and sponsors that we work with in order to leverage those capabilities for peak volumes and portfolio-wide implementation, as well as urgent situations in our responsiveness. In today's webinar, we're going to start off talking about a dichotomy that's emerging and existing in the development of lay summaries. Then we'll get into the actual writing of lay summaries, and finally we'll wrap up with some program setup and implementation discussion. At the end, we will be taking questions from the audience, as well as summarizing any responses that we receive from you with the prompts that we provide in the questions during the presentation. So let's start off with a background on patient engagement and introduce you to this topic of dichotomy. We know through CISCRIPT's Global Perception and Insights study in 2015 that 73% of participants want to receive a summary of their study results. Data from that same study indicates that receiving these results helps meet participant expectations, which in turn increases the likelihood for communicating within their community about their trial experiences, thus creating what you see here, a cycle of patient engagement that returns benefits to the research enterprise overall. This can lead to increased trust in research and interest in participation in the future. However, current transparency and regulatory environment creates unintended dichotomy between meeting patient needs in the spirit of patient engagement in contrast to meeting the needs of the general public in the spirit of transparency and regulatory requirements. In a few moments here, we'll take a look at a few examples of where this dichotomy can create potential divisions and decision points for sponsors with respect to both operational and developmental aspects of the lay summary. Now, thankfully, these do not have to be mutually exclusive outcomes. And I'm happy to say that CISCRIPT and Synchrogenics have been dedicated to finding solutions that balance these seemingly competing interests in our partnership. So the sponsors that we work with can meet both the standards of compliance expected from regulators, as well as the excellence and the quality of their programs and summaries for patients. The overarching theme here and the recurring question that I will pose is, what is your organization's level of commitment? Will you be checking boxes to meet regulatory requirements or engaging patients in a way that truly meets their needs? In order to have this discussion, it's important to have an overview of the current regulatory environment. We know that in the European Union, the clinical trials regulation, which will become effective in October 2018, requires a layperson summary for all interventional trials, phases 1 through 4. Sponsors must post these summaries to the EU portal within 12 months of the end of a clinical trial, and the lay summary is required in each of the local languages where the trial took place in the European Union. A quick note here on the timelines for pediatric studies. It's unclear if lay summaries for pediatric trials will also be required within 12 months, or, as is the case with non-pediatric trials, the reporting time frame will be paralleled with the technical summary. This would mean that lay summaries in all EU participating countries for pediatric trials would need to be posted within 6 months of the trial ending. So let's shift to the United States. The final rule on clinical trials registration and results information submission, which was made public last year, does not require the submission of technical or non-technical summaries. The rationale behind this is that the Secretary of Health and Human Protections did not identify evidence on the basis of which to conclude that there is a feasible way to ensure that the information contained in such summaries would be consistently produced without being misleading or promotional. They have, however, acknowledged that industry efforts to return results to participants may be informative, and they will review these as an ongoing research to evaluate the feasibility of making this a requirement for the U.S. Now here I will pose a question for the audience, and we'd love to hear your feedback. What other regulations or requirements are you aware of relating to lay language clinical trial regulations or communication? Now I do want to get into these examples and decision points where sponsors are faced with making a decision that demonstrates a commitment to patients or a commitment to meeting only regulatory requirements. The first example that I'll give is considering a basic principle of not just health communication, but communication in general, and that is to know your audience. The question here is, how can we simultaneously cater to a member of the general public with no prior knowledge of the trial or even research in general, while also creating a document that is truly focused on meeting the needs of a participant of a late-stage oncology trial, for example? An interesting anecdote here. When SysGroup developed our lay summary template through focus groups and user testing back in 2008, there was a clear request and need for a section about the study design and schedule. This has proven to be useful for participants that were actually in the trial, but this type of information is not called for in the EU's lay summary template, which again is meant for someone who has no prior knowledge of the trial. One would think that this type of background information about what happened during the trial would be even more critical for an audience member who does not have any prior knowledge about that trial. So the question here is, are we missing the mark for engaging patients, as well as providing the information that's necessary for the general audience to really understand the trial? Another sticking point, and a point of contention that I won't talk too much about, as Tatiana will cover this later. So right now, I'll just say that in terms of outcome and safety reporting, some sponsors we work with are committed to going beyond the regulatory requirements set forth by the EU. The reasons for this include ensuring meeting patient needs, as well as other compelling, scientifically sound rationale, such as reporting endpoints in later stage research in a way that aligns with regulatory submissions that rely on important findings of secondary endpoints that are statistically powered. We've even heard from sponsors that there are instances where they note discrepancies in their assessment of adverse reactions in their results documents compared to what the investigators thought. So we applaud and strongly support sponsors who are committed to implementing internal policies and processes that provide patients and the public with the information they deserve in a way that is not only understandable, but also remains non-promotional and unbiased. Now, the title of this webinar is Pitfalls, and I've just named a couple here that you might think about, but one really important one that we see continue to pop up in the development of lay summaries is linking to the full scientific report. Given the scope of these documents, it is important to include links to the full scientific reports. It would be difficult to align health communication and plain language principles with the complete reporting of information. And of course, there's also the consideration that you need to share the most scientifically supported information in order to avoid misinterpretation of the validity or applicability outside of the context of a single trial. However, far too often we're hearing that sponsors think it's okay to omit information that could be of interest to patients or the general public, as long as we provide a link to the full results. This is in direct opposition to the basic tenet of what we're doing here. The full results are technical. They are near impossible to process and understand for lay audiences, and in some cases, even accessing that information is an obstacle that they have to overcome. So I would say to you that linking to full results is not a catch-all. And again, it demonstrates what your level of commitment is to ensuring that patients, as well as the public, receive all the information that they should. Now, a final point that I'll bring up here in terms of this dichotomy is engaging readers. It's another basic principle in health communication in terms of using the second person to engage the reader. This is easily and appropriately incorporated when the audience is homogeneous, but it becomes difficult when you're trying to speak to patients as well as the general public. To highlight this, one of the most important elements of communicating with patients is to simply say, thank you. Thank you for taking part in this clinical trial. You have helped researchers learn more about the treatments for people with solid tumors, for example. You can still say thank you when the target audience is the general public, and it may seem like a minor difference in language. But you can understand how language that is directed to the participant would come across as more sincere and engaging on a personal level. Whereas in the development of a summary for the general public, it is difficult to speak directly to the study participant. Now that we've covered background information and touched on these high-level issues that sponsors are facing in the development of lay summaries, I'm going to pass it over to Tatiana, and she's going to take us further into the actual writing of lay summaries.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Beitash. So if I could remind everybody to just type in their questions into the chat box, that would be great. So I'm going to try to ask a few as we go along so that we can see where you guys are coming from too. So as we are entering this new age where the lay language, the patient-friendly language, is becoming more and more of a priority, for us, of course, as an organization, and I think for a lot of organizations, we started facing that challenge as to how do we learn to speak this language and to write in this language, and also stay true to the scientific roots, right? For us, with the staff of 200, it's also a challenge of teaching. How do you effectively teach this type of writing? So in terms of what we see is this kind of difference between what is interesting to patients and what is interesting to the scientists. This is a different kind of dichotomy than what Beitash was talking about, general public versus patients. So here, when we start thinking about what is patient really interested in, well, they really want to know, is this drug going to work for my disease? Is it dangerous? In general, patients want to know very exact answers, right? And from the scientific perspective, even if we take away any kind of commercial considerations, the scientists want to explain their experiment, and what clinical trial is the experiment in a very exact way, right? So they don't want to kind of give very straightforward conclusions. They want to say, you know, we tested this drug in a very particular setting with a particular population, and there might be some indication that it may work in these conditions. And that kind of thing is just is unsatisfying to the patient. So can we write these kinds of statements that would be satisfying to patients? One treatment is better than another. Did it improve symptoms? That's something that the patient would be interested in. However, that's too promotional. And unfortunately, very frequently, more often than not, it's inaccurate because it's not just based on one trial that the product is marketed and that we have a label. It's on the evidence that is collected across different trials. So we can't really give information that is worded that way. Now, when the scientists like to communicate, there's all of that information, that all of these words that we as scientists are very commonly using. And sometimes because we've been using these words for 20 years sometimes, we forget that these are actually incomprehensible to the wider audience who may not have that scientific background. Absorption, enzyme, antibody, these things we really have to still explain. So that doesn't work very well either. So how do we arrive in this space of scientifically valid, essentially plain language translation of an experiment that is both satisfying to the scientist from the scientific perspective and is providing satisfying information for the patient as well? Okay, so there are some thoughts about that, and one of them is, okay, we're going to write to the 6th to 8th grade level, okay? And therein lies another challenge. What 6th to 8th grade level varies greatly, even from just school to school in the same district. And certainly when you're looking at country to country, because of the different structure of curriculum, you know, in the States, science and math are very much pushed to the end of the education, while in other countries it's more spread. So when you're making that cut, you're getting comprehension of very different concepts. In terms of the guidances and tools, as Betash mentioned, they're very focused, right? And there are different groups that created different tools with different purposes. And while they're all helpful for us to understand the true spirit of what that middle ground looks like, none of them is an absolute solution. And certainly if there are other tools that your organizations are looking at or other trainings that your organizations are using and you find it to be successful, I would love for you to type that in the chat box, and at the end of the seminar we can potentially talk about some of the other tools and what our experience and your experience has been with them. But these are kind of the major ones. So what are the challenges with guidances and tools? There's definitely, as I mentioned, because the purposes of these, as they were developed, were different, there are several options that we still have to pick from. And something that is a CDC glossary versus in the University of Michigan glossary, there are different terms that we can pick from. The other challenge is that there is a limitation of scope. So the easy examples that we can go through very quickly become not that useful as we get into more complex study designs, into more complex disease states that we try to explain to patients effectively. And then there's this challenge of loose language around the inclusion of non-primary outcomes that Betash alluded to. How do we choose information that is still scientifically valid pertaining to the study design and what it is actually intended to show statistically, and then what is interesting to the patients? Okay, so moving on. Maybe metrics. Metrics can help us. And that is certainly something that we saw being stressed by EU regulations. There are several different types of metrics that are available. And again, some of them, they're focused on different aspects. The Flesch-Kincaid is the one that is most frequently referred to in this space. But they, of course, also have challenges. The first challenge is that longer words and sentences sometimes can be necessary. And here's an example of that. When we're talking about pyrexia versus fever, that's a good and easy translation. But when we're talking about infections, especially viral infections, where the specificity of the organism is going to make a difference, right? Then we get into situations where a longer explanation is the clearest. Another challenge is that there isn't really accounting for true comprehension. And what does that mean? There's how is the information flowing? what is the ordering of sections, and what makes the report visually appealing to the reader and is catching them in that pursuit of knowledge and true understanding of the clinical trial. But also, are we making any logical gaps, right? Based on our knowledge, we tend to, with scientific background, we tend to make these gaps that we assume that every reader is going to make. For example, that pizza is made out of carbohydrates. That's something that is well known if you are a scientist, but that may not be a well-known fact to somebody who is not coming from that scientific background. And then final challenge is really translation to other languages. If we are to start doing metrics in other languages, EU offers some metrics for other languages as well. How do we operationalize our translations and then do metrics on them? The standpoint that we took as our partnership is that we are working with vendors who are already trained in translating at the same level of comprehension, right, as the initial document. And here's another question for you guys. How does your organization review translated materials? Do they review a back translation as a standard practice? Are there participant-facing materials that are being reviewed as translations? We would certainly be curious to see and discuss at the end of the seminar. So what did we see? In the end, as we have been doing this for a while, we see that a good start to facility is about 6 months for our regulatory writers who have had many years of regulatory writing experience. About after 6 months and 10 to 20 summaries, they start feeling pretty good about writing in plain language, and they're starting to gain that facility. But what we see time and again is that we're constantly facing new challenges, new complex situations where we really have to think together as a team to understand what is the best way for us to explain complicated concepts. And here our patient reviewers, C-Scripts panel of lay language experts and patient advocates really comes into play. So as we go through that iteration, we get active and constant feedback as to what is working and what could be working differently. And we're constantly improving our understanding of how to keep in that middle space functionally, no matter what the situation is. So it's the team approach, it's constant iteration where we really find success in getting to the right space and spirit of the communication. So, okay, we have arrived in this middle space. That's fantastic. But then what happens is once we start working with teams, we get these pressure points on the space that are pushing us one way or the other on the scale. And it's our job, as we see it, to really continue staying in that space and then working with our teams to stay there. And here are some examples of the pressure points that I'll go through. And the first one is scalability, right? Some companies are going through 130 clinical trials a year, so they need to plan for that large-scale patient summary need that is going to be arising quickly. So one of the solutions that we see is that the clinical operations creates this master template. It incorporates necessary regulatory requirements into the summary, and then that kind of thought is that we're done here, we're prepared, this is going to be all that is going to be needed. However, as we start rolling through the documents, we find that that doesn't really quite work because each team wants to kind of make it their own, introduce their own specific language. And so the solution that we have for scalability is really starting not with the template, but starting cross-functionally with a good understanding of what plain language writing is and about that balance that we're trying to achieve. And creating ownership expectations with the group that is doing the authoring of the plain language, that the verbiage really has to stay with them, and the team is there to provide assurance of scientific validity, right? The other one is seeking a true cross-functional agreement and making sure that we are presenting our patients with the same message from the study to the study. So that comes from therapeutic area language agreement, study design approach, so that when they're reading their patient summary from a phase 1 trial in MS, we're explaining MS the same way as in the next patient summary from the next trial, right? So our patients are getting used to the same explanation and the same approach, and it becomes second nature and easier for them to understand. And then finally, you know, templates are great, but if we can have flexible and robust frameworks where we can draw upon different components upon which we agreed and really create a puzzle where each piece is defined, but then we put those pieces together in a way that is specific for each trial design, therapeutic area, any situation, that is the kind of approach that we are pursuing, and certainly seems like a little bit more of a flexible solution and a more robust start for variety of situations that we face. Another one is telling the story. So the challenge is that we all want to tell the story. As humans, we want something that has the beginning and the end, and there's something to get excited about. And sometimes the desire to tell a compelling story can shift the balance in a way that is not very appropriate. And one example here is that a company was doing a safety and PK trial in a specific disease, and as they were doing this trial, they found some incredible efficacy. And as they found this efficacy, or indication of efficacy, I should say, that the trial was not powered to explore, they wrote a manuscript. The manuscript was very well received, and so as the team began to approach this patient summary, they felt that it was important to stress these findings around efficacy because they, in the spirit, felt that that would be of most interest to patients. However, that is not what the trial is supposed and designed to show, right? The trial is primarily the safety and PK trial. So creating that kind of communication becomes promotional and inappropriately focused from the scientific point of view. So what do we suggest? As our best practice, we use regulated documents like CSRs as a source. We understand the study design and the protocol and statistical analysis plan to ensure that what we are reporting is scientifically in agreement with what the intent of the study is and what the design actually supports. And then we work with teams to set expectations as to the requirements of the regulatory agencies around the reporting. So I think you're hearing a lot of that theme with me around creating expectations with teams and team education, and then delivering on these expectations. So certainly, as we move to the end of the seminar, I would love to hear in chat boxes what your approach has been to educating your teams. And of course, having said that, we all have that pressure to post the summaries within 1 year, right? So the question, another question to you guys is, do you feel like you're going to have these near final CSRs available 10 to 11 months after the last patient last visit in Europe? to meet these timelines, because the creation of the CSR or the parallel authoring of the patient summaries is also kind of the fork in the road that we're facing to meet some of these regulatory compliance deadlines. So the final pressure point that I'm going to talk about is the lack of continuity. So, and that is around the patient voice and when it's not reflected in the regulatory documentation start to finish. And an example here is there's this trial, right, for a company, and they're doing some blood draws for PK, and they're doing a bunch of blood draws for a biomarker analysis that is going to be done later. And what it looks like from the patient perspective is that they're getting pricked quite many times. And so as we write this, the patient summary, this biomarker draw is not truly a part of the objective set for the CSR, so it's not even reflected in the CSR. So we're kind of not writing about it in the patient summary and assuming the patients won't wonder what all of those blood samples were for. And that's a challenge, right? Because from the personal perspective, this is a big part of the trial that patients will wonder about, and we have to make sure that as we continue communicating the purpose of the trial, and yes, it was somewhere buried in the informed consent, and they had to tick their name by it, sometime before, that we have clarity around what happens to the patients. So here we have all of this documentation that happens, right? The protocol, the patient-friendly summary design, the ICF, the CSR, plain language summary, and then patient labeling. And creating continuity throughout that path and really putting the patient in the center and having that patient voice be heard as we are moving through that paradigm puts us in a really positive place. And for me, that means really starting with the design, right? Are we ensuring that we are only doing the necessary assessments? Are we using innovation and technology to get rid of the blood draws through modeling and simulation? Or are we avoiding clinical trials completely through PBPK modeling and use, for example, for exploring DDIs, right? Are we creating our trials humanely so that we're only asking of our patients to give of themselves to the extent that is necessary to explore a given question, and really use that innovation and technology to drive our decisions and our study design. And then providing an equivalent to CT.gov posting of a trial where a patient can easily understand what the study is about, creating an ICF that is readable and not just in legalese, right, while meeting the legal requirements as well, moving through the CSR and the plain language summary reflecting the scientifically valid picture of the clinical trial, and then feeding into the patient labeling appropriately. So that is where, I apologize. I would love to give the presentation back to Betash. Betash, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tatiana. And so as Tatiana mentioned, there's quite a bit that we can do further upstream than the actual development of the lay summary to try and meet patient needs in a better way. Right now, we're sort of constrained by those things that may need to change, but there are things that we can do right away. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us through the process that SysGroup and Synchrogenics follows in our programs that provide lay language summaries. We start the process at the beginning of the study in the informed consent document and set expectations for the participants that they will be receiving the results of the clinical trial in a format that's understandable. Now, we're very pleased that recently developed guidance recommends following this process, which also aligns with the recommendations in the Declaration of Helsinki, especially since our research has shown that more than half of patients, 52%, said it's very important to know before deciding to enroll if summary results will be provided. So this is something that can actually be an indicator of participation in clinical research. I do, however, want to flag this as another potential important decision point in terms of commitment. As the first potential touch point with participants, the ICF really provides a tremendous opportunity to demonstrate your commitment to meeting patient needs. Will you simply add a statement in your ICF that says the results will be made available to you? Or will you detail the methods of dissemination that you plan to use? Some of this, of course, requires planning and decision-making ahead of ICF drafting that speaks more to your internal program for providing the results. And we'll get into that in just a minute here. But sticking with this idea of meeting volunteer needs, meeting participant needs, SysGroup provides a thank you communication as participants are leaving the trial in order to remind them that they will receive the results, as well as thanking them and honoring them for their role in advancing medical science. Again, I mentioned the importance of thanking volunteers, and it seems intuitive. And with a few cultural exceptions that we've seen, I certainly think that everyone here believes very strongly in demonstrating this appreciation for patients. Yet sometimes we forget to do it in truly meaningful ways. And I'll point again to the EU's lay summary template that doesn't call for a message of thanks to participants in the lay summary itself. However, the guidance document does acknowledge directing patients to the lay summary portal and the lay summary document itself as not the only means of communicating with them. So basically, they are recommending that you go above and beyond the lay summary and communicate with your patients in appropriate ways, but that really do make them feel respected as well as meet their needs. For longer trials, beyond the thank you communication, we provide brief annual communications once or twice per year to ensure that participants are updated on the availability of results. Both of these communications are printed and they're sent to the investigative sites, who then pass it on to their patients. Investigative sites appreciate this opportunity to strengthen their relationship with their patients. We also take the opportunity in these communications to provide general education about the research process. This is a very important point and again speaks to your level of commitment. Are you simply meeting the regulatory requirements or transparency requirements, or are you taking the opportunities that are appropriately there to enhance the experience of clinical research participants and enhance their knowledge of what it means to be a clinical research participant? The endpoint of the process is, of course, reporting the results, providing the lay language summary to participants in some way or shape or form, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a second. Now, in addition to the capabilities of the partnership that we've highlighted here as well as earlier, we go beyond that, and we have helped sponsors develop and implement full portfolio-wide programs that provide results for study participants as well as meeting the EU's clinical trial regulation. To start the process, we recommend beginning your program development with pilot projects. This continues to be an important predictor of successful full portfolio-wide implementation. Building on real-world experiences from pilot projects helps you develop SOPs, workflows, and internal educational materials that are needed to ensure a successful and smooth rollout across your full portfolio. In order to make this successful, you of course need to engage key stakeholders from your organization early on and determine their roles in this process. More on this in just a minute. Now, you also want to plan your implementation as well as any evaluation cycles to scale up over time. Some sponsors roll out their program by early versus late stage development. Some sponsors make the leap and implement the program right away across their full portfolio. It really depends on your needs, and SysGroup as well as Thinkergenics are here to help you with making those decisions as well as successfully implementing those programs. Now, time is quickly escaping us with regard to the EU's regulation, and more importantly, we want all participants to receive study results as soon as possible. So we recommend starting now. The fact that you've joined this webinar is an excellent start, and so let's build on that. But don't reinvent the wheel. There are existing templates and guidances out there that you can follow. Tatiana has highlighted some of the issues with these, and again, this is where engaging with experts in this field will help your program tremendously. The templates in and of themselves do not ensure the summary is understandable or that the language used is non-promotional. Care must be taken with each and every summary to assess the appropriateness of the content. We've received a couple of different questions relating to this in our chat here during the webinar, and we're going to be happy to address those and highlight the importance of this point. Consistency is a growing concern, not just within a sponsor's portfolio, but enterprise-wide. So the greater consistency that we can achieve in these documents across all clinical trial result summaries, the more familiarity and understanding that we can achieve with patients and the public when they look at these summaries. Of course, a critical consideration in program setup is that baseline commitments to meet regulatory requirements will not necessarily meet the needs of your patients. Again, our role here is to ensure that you are compliant with the regulations as well as aligned with available industry guidance and best practices in meeting patient needs. We do recommend that your pilot programs start off simply. So you might start with a single phase clinical trial without any foreign language translations other than English. And then as you scale up in your pilot programs, you'll add larger scale trials that are multinational that will require translations, and then also test your dissemination or posting processes. Of course, at the end, and the recurring theme here about your commitment is always putting patients first. There is somewhat of a great debate going on about the dissemination methods of providing results to patients. The EU requires posting of the lay summary to their forthcoming portal. Some sponsors are going above and beyond this to post summaries on other portals or websites, either third-party or industry, that are designed for ease of access. We're so pleased with this progress, but we do also have to raise the consideration about overall accessibility. Not all participants have access to the internet, and even if they do, we can't ensure everyone will be able to navigate portals like the EU's. Some sponsors we work with will continue to demonstrate their deep commitment to ensuring every participant has the opportunity to learn about the results by receiving a printed lay summary via their study sites. Finally, it is a very important consideration long-term to look at not just the return of aggregate results, but individual results. And this is where portals can come into handy. Returning individual results is what we know that patients want in addition to the overall aggregate results. Tatiana has highlighted a couple of important points similar to this. SysGroup has worked with sponsors to return blinding or unblinding patients, informing of the treatments that they received, for example. But going even further than that into individual lab results is something that we see sponsors working on, and we encourage it. And we're so happy to see that progress, and we do think that that's the future. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago selecting your key sponsor functions that will help not only in the development of your program, but also obviously in the development of lay summaries. You need to identify a cross-functional implementation team. This can include folks from clinical operations, medical writing, regulatory, as well as any of the other groups that you see on this slide here. Your program setup team will very likely vary from your lay summary development and review team. In working with multiple sponsors of varying sizes and structures, I feel it's important to note that one size does not fit all in terms of how your program is structured. You might mirror other processes that you already have in place, for example, CSR development to begin with, but then you'll find that streamlining and making adjustments to those processes to make it specific to lay summary development is what is best for you. And a final point that I'll touch on here before we get to the Q&A is the management and responsibility internally from your teams. Some sponsors are keeping this responsibility within the study team. Others are moving it to a group that's external to that, such as a transparency manager, or even going so far as to work with partners such as SysScript and Synchronous for us to manage your processes. We're happy to do that, and again, one size does not fit all. Another important reason why you need to get started on this right away, not just in developing lay summaries, but also in the development of your program and processes. I do believe here that Tatiana wanted to give acknowledgement to Sudipta Chakrabarty. She is a regulatory writer at Synchronous. I've had the pleasure of working with her on many occasions, and she has contributed significantly to this presentation here. Now, we have received a number of questions through the Q&A sort of section of the webinar here, and we're so happy to address them. If you have others, please do send them through. We're going to be happy to get through as many of these as possible, although we are coming up on time.
Okay, thank you so much, Betosh and Tatiana. We've got a ton of great questions from your audience. Please do submit your questions to Tatiana and Betosh through the Q&A. First question from our audience. It's required to demonstrate that the lay language summary is understandable. Is it difficult to find an accurate literacy test to prove this? What is the best way to test understandability?
And I think I'll handle this one, and then Tatiana, if you do have anything to add, please do. And there was a couple of other questions too that related to this, so hopefully we can sort of answer in batches here. In the development of SysScript's template, as well as our early pilot projects with Pfizer, we user tested the comprehension of our lay summaries, and we did demonstrate an increase in comprehension based on the strategies that we use to develop the lay summaries. Now, these strategies include, as I mentioned earlier, graphic design to ensure the layout and presentation of the information is organized and structured in such a way that increases comprehension for a lay audience. But very importantly, as you mentioned here, metrics will not ensure understandability on their own. Tatiana spent quite a bit of time demonstrating that and the reasons why here. So the way that our partnership works, the process that we follow, that is also a recommendation in the EU's guidelines for the lay summaries, is utilizing a panel of experts in lay language communication who have spent years and years developing their skills. But also, this panel includes a review of each and every lay summary that we develop by a panel of patients, patient advocates, and specialists within the specific therapeutic area. So each and every lay summary that we produce is reviewed by a new group within that therapeutic area. This may not sound like a scalable solution, but we found that it is. And we will continue to employ this effort. We will continue to use this strategy because it's how we feel that we can truly understand not just comprehension and understandability, but also truly ensure that these summaries are non-promotional and non-biased.
Thanks, Betosh. Someone would like to know, wants to know, the EMA Annex 5 states that 10 areas to be covered. The guidance then, however, states that while required titles cannot be changed, they can be combined. This could result in lay summaries with different headings and layout of content. Is this acceptable?
So I'm happy to jump in here, and again, Tatiana, if you have something to add, please do.
That's good. All right, Betosh, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So the guidance that you are referring to is actually what was a draft guidance. It was put out for public comment, and we fully expect that in the final version, there is not only going to be great flexibility in terms of translating headings that correspond to Annex 5 requirements into language that is understandable for a lay audience, but also we expect that the guidance will provide great flexibility in the organization of the information itself, which is very important for us. We do feel like in doing this over the past however many years, we've developed a narrative and a flow in our lay summaries that truly does lead to greater comprehension. However, of course, we are always open to continuous improvement, and I know also from what I've heard from the folks working on that EU guidance work stream that they will be open to hearing further thoughts and, essentially further experiences and research from the folks that are doing this so that they can improve their guidance as well. That would be further down the line, but I do hope that answers your question. I know actually that there was a second part of this, and that's consistency. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Consistency is very important, not just internally in terms of the lay summaries that you produce, and Tatiana touched on that, but also across the entire industry. It's why using templates is important. It's why aligning on templates is important, because if we're delivering summaries that are formatted differently, that look differently, that organize information differently, that is not going to achieve absolute optimal understanding across all audiences that are accessing these documents. Having said that, we need to have realistic expectations, and we know that we'll get there eventually, and for now, we're just happy to be doing this activity in such a way that we are reaching as many people as possible.
You mentioned patient advocates can help determine the appropriate level of understandability. Since many patient advocates are experts in one therapeutic area, do you recommend we engage with multiple advocates, or can a single group be effective?
So I think yeah, go ahead, Tati. I was going to say, I think I just touched on that, and I'll let you expand on it.
Definitely. So definitely, as Betash mentioned, it's really iteration, right? There is no magic pill as to, you take and then you become a lay language expert. And for us, it just means doing it over and over and doing it in the realm of this, the patient summary, right? So producing patient-friendly language around study information. It is actually a little bit different. And even though we have folks who have worked in this type of translation of information from medical and scientific terms to more plain language realm, right, and certainly have a vast amount of experience, to us it's really a team approach. Though individuals who have been doing that for many years and whom we consider plain language experts, we work hand in hand with them to really tackle this new realm of translation, if we want to call it that, into plain language of clinical trials, where we're facing new challenges every day.
Just wanted to share a piece of feedback from one of our audience members. One of our audience members put in the chat that she encourages her researchers to thank the participants about 1 week after they enroll in the study, and to include the contact information for the coordinators in the letter and email that they send to them, and then as well at the end of the study. So that's great to know that folks on the call are already thinking about thanking the people who participate in clinical studies. Someone else in the audience wants to know, while writing lay language summaries, are you referring to any lay language glossaries? In addition, what points do you consider in evaluating a plain language summary?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we use a variety of glossaries, right? But the challenge with glossaries is that they all, there are differences, and different terms are preferred by different glossaries. So fundamentally, we have our own glossary of preferred terms that we have tested in experience and we feel really good about. But we work with sponsors, too, to make sure that we are addressing their preferences, because while certain terms we truly feel very passionate about, that certain choice is the one that leads to the best comprehension, with other terms there is a little bit of leeway as to what we would want to use. So certainly I would still encourage everybody to think through the glossary that they plan to use. But it is helpful, yes.
Great. Someone from the audience would like you to speak to the QC process you use for reviewing drafts of lay summaries.
Sure. So Synchrogenics, we have a very kind of standard QC policy. So a QC against the source documents before the documents go for sponsor review. And that means the very first time, but it also means that every time there is a draft, before it goes out for review, it gets QC'd, because that just keeps folks from being distracted with errors or typos and really focusing on the purpose of the review.
Someone would like to know about the structure of the SysScript patient panel, i.e. how many patients are in the panel, and is there a different patient panel for different therapeutic areas?
Sure, and I think I spoke a little bit to that. There is a individual panel brought together for each and every lay summary that's produced, which of course is focused on whatever therapeutic area the lay summary is in. We will include individuals from these three different categories, which is patients, patient advocacy, which is people from patient advocacy organizations, as well as specialists who have scientific and medical expertise in the therapeutic area.
Can you elaborate more on linking to the scientific summary?
Sure. So this is a best practice. You should always link to any available additional information in terms of the results of the summary of the trial in the lay summary. However, I do want to caution again, this is not a catch-all. The basic principle that we're following here is that information, even if it is publicly available, that is posted on clinicaltrials.gov or UJIS-CT, this information is not accessible, nor is it comprehensible for lay audiences. Therefore, you need to think very carefully and consider what is the information that is meeting the EU's requirements or meeting other regulatory requirements you may have, as well as meeting patient needs. Hopefully that helps.
Yep, we have one last, we have time for one last question from the audience. Just want to reassure our audience that we do capture all your questions, and if we can't answer them out loud, we can always email you our responses. Someone wants to know about the major differences in writing lay summaries for the United States versus EU regulatory submissions.
So I would clarify that the juxtaposition is probably EU regulatory submissions versus any other lay summaries that you write, not just for the U.S. And the major difference, again, is that the EU's guidelines and the content within it are specifically geared towards a general audience, not the study participants. And therefore, if you do not, again, carefully consider what information you're providing, how you're providing it, both in the development of your lay summary, but also in the programs that you design to produce lay summaries and provide them to patients, you may end up missing the mark in terms of patient engagement if you don't go above and beyond the EU's regulatory requirements, which again is something that sponsors that we're working with have strongly communicated with us as their desire. They are putting patients first, and that's what we like to hear.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tatiana.